Today we are going to discuss weak entity set. What do you mean by a weak entity set? For example, a weak entity set is a set or it's a relation in which you are not possible to identify a particular tuple using a primary key. That means there doesn't exist any primary key for that relationship. For example, suppose that I have a relationship like if you have an employee entity, and suppose that you have another relationship, another entity which is dependent, and suppose that this employee is having this is employee ID as the primary key, and some other uh, attributes are also existing. Here, this dependent is having dependent name, say relation with this employee. That means relationship with the employee, and suppose that the date of birth is also there. That means when you are treating this, that means this employee has a dependent. Employee has a dependent, and this is related to this using a relationship which is has a employee has a dependent. Employee can have more than one dependents, or employee even doesn't have any dependent. That means this is a kind of relationship. And see here, suppose that I am going to have a table for this, and this dependent is having dependent name, then a relation and date of birth. Suppose that for a particular employee here, suppose that the name of a person is AAA and relationship is say son, and date of birth is XXYY and there may be another employee and his dependent may also have this AAA as name, then son and same date of birth. Then these are multiple entries which is having the same data value. That means you cannot distinguish between this and this. Why? That means this is a weak entity. That means name as such, name of a person is not an identifier. Relationship with this entity is not a primary key, and date of birth is also not a primary key. In that case, we say that this is a weak entity. That means, suppose that you are working in a firm, and in your database you have another dependent database of those employees, and suppose that a dependent database like this name relationship relation, this is the name of the dependent and this is a relationship with the dependent and this is his date of birth. Then every employee has a dependent, and now suppose that this is a relation, every employee has a dependent, and employees, there are employees who have not any dependent, so this is a strong connection is not there and dependent is connected like this. That means here this is a kind of relation, but this dependent is fully dependent on, that means if a dependent exists, then to distinguish between these two dependents, so that means the same name, same relationship and same date of birth, if you want to distinguish between this tuple and this tuple, you want to know who is the employee or who is this is the dependent of which employee. That means this entity or this entity dependent is actually, it is a dependent, it is depending on this employee entity to distinguish a particular record. That's why we call it as a weak entity set. That means without an employee entity, without this employee entity, this cannot exist. That means a weak entity set means you are not able to distinguish between different tuples in that relationship without another entity. That means this entity as such is not existing. That means that is dependent on some other entity. That's why we call it as a weak entity. So to make it dependent on this, what you are going to do is this has to be, that means this is a weak relationship, and here also you can do this, and here you have to, that means if an entity which is having double lines, that means here we have single lines, here double lines means, that means this is is a rectangle with double lines. That means this is a weak entity set. This one does not exist as that means this is not existing independently. That is dependent on this employee. So if you want to distinguish between this and this, you should know who is the employee. That means this is the dependent. This is dependent on some employee. This is dependent on some other employee. That means this tuple or this entity is dependent on some other entity. Dependent on some other entity. In that case, we call it as this is the owner of that. That means this is the owner of this dependent, and this is owned by. This is owned by, or dependent is owned by employee and employee is the owner of dependent. Here this is a relationship, a weak relationship. This is actually a weak relationship, and this is a weak entity. Weak entity set in the sense this does not exist if this does not exist, but this can exist even if this doesn't exist. Okay, in that case, what you have to do is here for this weak entity set, you have to add one more attribute here, which is employee ID here also. Suppose that if you are going to add employee ID also here, what will happen? This will become a strong entity set. That means in that case a primary key is there. Or here you can have Hasse relationship. In that relationship, that means there is a mapping from employee ID to that dependent. In that case also, this weak entity set can become strong. That means a weak entity set does not exist if it is not attached to a strong entity set. Strong entity set can exist without any help from other entities, but weak entity sets are dependent on the other strong entity set. So this is called weak entity set, and weak entity set is always identified by these double lines. That means that a rectangle, this is a rectangle, and that rectangle is drawn using double lines, and this is a weak relationship that is also drawn using double lines. We said that this strong entity set is the owner of this weak entity set, or weak entity set is owned by the strong entity set. So in a relationship here, if you are drawing a single line, what that means? This is not a strong relationship. That means this employee, even if an employee who is not having any dependent, he can exist. But a dependent, if he is a dependent, he should be connected to an employee. That means here this is totally participating in this relationship. That means every dependent should be there in this relationship, but employee, there may be employees who have no dependents. In that case, this employee is not having total participation. That means there are employees in this relationship who are not taking part in this relation. That means here the cardinality, minimum cardinality is 0 and maximum cardinality is employee can, that means here n. And here what is this? If you have a dependent, then here you should have 1 and m. That means here an employee, suppose that you have an employee and there is no restriction or there is no rule like he has to participate in this relationship. That means an employee in the employee database can exist even if he is not having any dependent. But if a dependent is there in the dependent database, then definitely that dependent should have an employee connected using this. That means this is a strong entity, this is a strong participation, means this is total participation. That means if you are having double ends in this relationship, that means total participation. That means if you have a dependent, then that should be connected to an employee. Here this is not total participation, this is partial participation. Why? Here an employee can exist even if he is having any dependence. He is not having any dependent. That means this is partial participation. So partial participation is designated using or it is drawn using a single line, and total participation using double lines. And if you have a weak entity set, then that should have total partnership in this relation. That means if you have a dependent, then there should be an employee connected to that dependent. Okay, so that's all about weak entity sets and participation, total as well as partial participation. Total participation in the sense every tuple in that entity set should participate in this relationship. If it is partial participation, there can be one or more tuples in that entity set which is not taking part in this relationship. Okay, so that is regarding total participation, partial participation. Here, total participation is indicated by double lines and partial participation by single lines. Okay.